Thank you for joining us for another session of Becoming Biblical Elders, focused on God-honoring elder meetings. In this session, Rocky Wyatt, Executive Director of XL Ministries, and Tom Pennington, Senior Pastor of Countryside Bible Church, discuss what it looks like to function well in a meeting with a plurality of leadership.
Hello, I'm Rocky Wyatt. I'm the Executive Director of XL Ministries, and I have the privilege to be here with Tom Pennington, who is the pastor-teacher of Countryside Bible Church in Southlake, Texas. He's also the voice of the Word Unleashed, which is his preaching and teaching ministry. Today we're going to be talking about God-honoring elder meetings. Pastor Tom, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, my joy, Rocky.
Just think there are a lot of things that we could talk about that relate to having God-honoring elder meetings. And you know, you hear some stories, some of them not so good, about what happens within the leadership of the church, and we would like to avoid those things. So just let's begin by explain how critical it is to have biblically qualified elders if you intend to have God-honoring elder meetings.
Well, I mean, you and I both know that's where it starts. And frankly, that's where the problems start for most elder boards. So it begins, I think, because pastors, elders choose potential elders for all the wrong reasons. You know, first of all, they come with a corporate board model. It's like, if this guy's a successful businessman, then, you know, I want him, maybe he'll give more. I mean, all the wrong reasons to put somebody on your elder board. And so there are other reasons as well, but those are some of the ones that are out there and really dominate churches. And when you start with men who have some administrative ability, who have, you know, experience in the business world or whatever, but don't meet the biblical qualifications, you're just asking for trouble, because now you're dealing with a man potentially who lacks the spiritual qualifications and therefore the spiritual maturity to deal with disagreements. I think of Galatians 5. I mean, when a person is not mature and is functioning at some level from their fallenness, from their flesh, they're manifesting all of the wrong qualities for there to be unity, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you read that list of the deeds of the flesh, and it's like fights and contentions and arguments, and, well, hello, there are too many elder meetings, right? Mm-hmm. And so it begins if you don't have men who are spiritually mature and spiritually qualified, because they are not primarily characterized by the fruit of the Spirit, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how I think of it. I know it's a simplistic way in some ways to think about it, but what do you want your elder meeting to look like? Do you want it to look like the deeds of the flesh, or do you want it to look like the fruit of the Spirit? Well, you're going to choose then men, first and foremost, who demonstrate spiritual maturity, who demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit, and of course the qualifications of Titus 1, 1 Timothy 3, at a character level, because then you're dealing with men who have the maturity to disagree about something, but to deal with it in a way that isn't disagreeable, and can talk about it, can respect others, can come together. They're not given to pride and that sort of, you know, I'm going to protect my turf at all cost, because of who they are. So, there's nothing more foundational to good elders meetings than having good elders, men who are truly biblically qualified in terms of their spiritual qualifications and maturity. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've been in, I hope you wouldn't say this at Countryside, but you've been in some elder meetings where, you know, you've seen the other. Wouldn't you say that that's where it starts?
Yeah. And as I visit churches, you just recognize that there's a lot of trouble if you don't have qualified men in the position. So the pastor can desire God-honoring elder meetings all day long, but if you don't have God-honoring men that are mature.
Do you think it starts just from a desire to have a warm body? I mean, you know, the ministry gets overwhelming, and there's more to do than I can do. We need help, and so let's get somebody, and maybe there isn't care given to that. I mean, where do you think that starts?
I think that can be part of it, but, you know, recently I was listening to a church discussion where they are required in their constitution to have so many elders in their church. And so to meet that number, they got to find somebody put a warm body in there. And it's not that they're not trying to find somebody that hopefully will fit and be right, but they're not equipping, training, qualifying, shepherding that man to eldership. And so, and again, I'm not saying these are not necessarily godly men, that is, men who love the Lord and really desire to please the Lord, but they're not often equipped to do. They're not theologically. They're expecting the pastor to be the one. You teach sound doctrine. You refute those who contradict. But all of the elders are supposed to have that ability and the shepherding elements of ministry. I think many churches see the elders mostly as decision makers on a once a month or twice a month board meeting, and it's like
it's that corporate model.
Yes, and it's not. It's just not eldership. And then I'll be honest, I think sometimes pastors are just overwhelmed, and it's hard to see how they can invest in the lives of men to help equip them for ministry. So,
or they lack just the practical how-to. They want to, the desire's there. Maybe they're even willing to invest the time, but they lack the tools.
Yeah, need some tools. So how does Countryside invest in men? You know, just generally, we don't have to get too specific, but just generally, in what ways does Countryside invest in men to help them to recognize if they're qualified, and then if they're qualified, to help them gain the experience and the Bible knowledge to get where they need to be if they're going to serve in the role?
Yeah, you know, I think it starts with you have to be regularly, as an elder board, looking at the men in your church and where they are spiritually, where they are in gifting, how they're serving, because somehow you have to be saying, who are those men that are potentially those who could rise to elders? Not that they will, but what does that pool look like? Well, if you're looking at 1 Timothy 3, it looks like those who are faithful already in teaching. They have to be demonstrating the gift of teaching. You know, it's pretty ridiculous to put a guy who's never taught anything into the role of elder, and you don't know if he's even gifted by Christ to be in that role. Because that's, in addition to the spiritual qualifications, he has to be able to teach and he has to be able to manage, proven by how he manages his household. And so I think it starts by looking and identifying. We have a couple meetings a year when, as you know, we sit back and say, who are the men in our church who are, A, demonstrating the spiritual qualifications, we think, to be potentially elders now or in the future, and secondly, who is teaching regularly, and what can we do to encourage that, to equip them, to maybe even put an elder in a situation to give them feedback and direct them, and so that's part of it. I think also, in addition to that, just trying to have a plan in place to train men to teach, even if it's not as an elder, to teach the scriptures. Maybe it's as simple as to their families, but then in other contexts in the church, whether it's in children's classes or home fellowships or so forth, helping them learn how to teach. And what happens is, as you do that, it strengthens the church as a whole, but out of that you begin to see the sort of cream of the crop rise, and you say, wow, here are some men the Lord has really uniquely gifted to teach His Word. And as we look at their lives, we see they're faithful. We see we believe they have the spiritual qualifications. And so you begin to see that pool, if you will, form without making any promises or commitments to them, without having made a final decision. You begin to see that potential pool shape. And as elders, we talk about that. We pray about that. We interact with those men and we watch them to see what the Lord might do.
And it's just going to require an investment, right? I mean, that's going to have to be the priority of a church.
No
question. It's going to have to be the priority of the pastor, priority of the existing elders. Otherwise, you just perpetuate whatever the pattern's been.
And you know, I know that this is a passion of yours, and so I'll just say this. I think, and you and I have talked many hours about this, but I do think that there is a sort of neglect of the basic responsibility of a church to equip and train men for ministry. And so they just offload it. You know, it's like, okay, here's a guy that we think wants to go into full-time ministry. Well, we'll just give him a little extra money and send him off to seminary, and that's our investment. That's not an investment in training and preparing a man for ministry. in some senses, the same thing is true with lay elders. It's like, okay, we identified this guy, and maybe we spent a little time inspecting where he is biblically and theologically just to make sure he's not a heretic. Mm-hmm. Okay, be warmed and be filled. Go lead. And there's no training, there's no equipping, there's no preparation of that guy. And both of those courses are really fraught with danger and, frankly, often disaster.
You know, one of the things I think is interesting that is accomplished here at Countryside is you think generationally. That is, how is our elder board, elder leaders developing so that not only do you have the wisdom of those who are much older, and obviously you don't want to go too young because you have to meet qualifications and be able to fulfill responsibilities. Nonetheless, you do have to equip those who are younger because they're going to be the leaders of the next generation. I mean, you and I are going to be enjoying our time in the presence of the Lord one day, right? And other guys are going to be carrying on. So how does Countryside think about that? Because you see that in the makeup of the elders.
Well, I think you touched on it. It's intentionally developing that generational mindset. We are, first of all, we know that we want the church to be faithful for generations to come if the Lord wills. We can't guarantee that. We know that. But we can intentionally invest to that end. And so I think realizing that we have to be, first of all, we have to be looking at the next generation of elders. And by next generation, I mean, who are those who are within the next 1 to 5 years going to be potential elders because of their maturity, their gifting, all of those things, and intentionally praying for them, investing in them, looking for ways to build out their ministry experience without making any commitments or promises to them, but looking for ways to say, we think that might be someone the Lord has gifted and given to this church. Let's invest in that person and let's get them the feedback they need. Let's get an elder in their life, if they're not already in a ministry where that's happening, and let's begin to look in that direction. But I think even beyond that, it involves recognizing that we want to be intentional in training our youth and our kids with something, with truth, rather than just, glorified babysitting. We want at every appropriate stage to be pouring into them a confidence in the Scripture and be challenging them to do what they're supposed to do. So I love the fact, and you set this up before I came in the youth ministry, the kids are challenged at the youth level to serve. Why? Because that's what Christians do. And if they don't learn to do that at a young age, then guess what? They grow up without knowing that that's what Christians do. And so they grow up thinking they can just come in and, be a spectator in a church. And so I think intentionally at every category, in an age-appropriate way, saying, what do Christians do? Well, Christians don't neglect the corporate worship, so making sure that that's a priority as young as they can handle it and be trained by their parents. And we try even as parents to get our kids taking notes and listening. When my kids were too young to take notes, we let them draw pictures, but only pictures that related to what they were hearing. And then as they got older, my wife would sit next to them and she would write out the outline, leaving blanks for them to, insert the letter or the words, and developing those skills so that they understand the priority of corporate worship. So having your kids engaged in that, that's a huge priority, and we want to make sure that happens. But beyond that, serving, serving others, thinking of ways to do that. I mentioned, in the youth ministry and on up, that's a priority. So all of those things, engaged in other people's lives. So, at the youth level, having the discipleship groups and then, of course, encouraging that in classes and home fellowships, and because that's what Christians do. So I think being intentional to say, if we're going to equip the next generation, we want to be building those priorities into the lives of the younger people, even without them fully understanding or knowing that. They get a sense of, this is what church is, this is what Christians do.
Yeah. So critical. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, if we're not equipping those who are going to be the leaders of church, we've failed miserably in so many respects. I'm going to ask you just questions that are just those practical elements of elder meetings that you just have to have, and just get your perspective on them. So among a group of elders, would you say that there's generally a leader among leaders? How would you describe that?
You know, that's an interesting question, because the answer is yes and no. Because it's yes if all you mean is there are going to be people who are inherently more compelling leaders, just by virtue of how God's wired them, how He's made them. I mean, you see that in the disciples. We talk about that as sort of the perfect model. Our Lord had 12 disciples, but there are groups within those disciples, and the same person shows up at the head of each of those lists. And of course, Peter is often the spokesman of the 12. He was a leader among leaders. It's not that that leader among leader has greater intrinsic authority. In fact, I think that's a misunderstanding.
Right.
But he does have an inherent greater sense of leadership just because of how the Lord's wired him. And that may be because of, his personality, his experience. It might be because he's the one who does most of the corporate teaching. You know, in my case, I think I'm not necessarily a compelling personality, but I think I bear more leadership among our elders simply by virtue of the fact that I am the senior pastor. I'm the pastor teacher, the one who does the teaching primarily in the corporate worship. And so I'm the voice that's often heard, and that gives me, I think, a greater sense of that. So it can be for different reasons. But absolutely, I think it's true. The no part of the answer is if you mean I now need to exert greater influence to get my way over the group, or I have greater intrinsic authority. You know, and let me just say, I do think it's important to understand how plurality works, because a lot of guys have this sense that once I'm an elder, I am now in equal authority over everything in the church. Well, that's just not true. You have to understand Christ is the head of the church, and He appoints over this church and over each individual church, He appoints elders. And collectively, together, those elders have authority over the church. I don't have any authority over anything in the church individually, unless the entire collective elder board has delegated that authority to me. And that happens. The entire elder board can't do everything, right? I mean, they can't run the office every day. They can't oversee the staff. They can't do all those things. So the entire elder board delegates its collective authority from Christ to either individual elders or groups of elders. But they still don't operate as their own authority. They're operating under that delegated authority from the entire elder board. And I think that's such an important mindset to keep in mind to protect you against using that, I'm a leader among leaders. Well, that means, I'm going to drive this train, get on board, and sort of misunderstanding what your role really is. So, yes, there are leaders among leaders, and that's always true. But no, there are not those with intrinsic greater authority who ought to then exert their power and influence to get their way.
Right. Usually among elders, there's a chairman for a year, a period of time, multiple years permanently. It varies from church to church. I know there's not necessarily a thus saith the Lord,
right.
Okay? But maybe just give your perspective and how you've done that at Countryside and how that's worked.
Yeah, no, as you said, it's not a thus saith the Lord. The scriptures do leave some latitude for some of the outworking of these things to the elders of a local church. You've heard me say often, I think the decisions we have to make morally fall into three categories. Either it's thus saith the Lord, thou shalt, chapter and verse, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not, chapter and verse, or it's an issue of conscience. And when it comes to the church, those issues of conscience are decided by the collective elder board.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's latitude to make those decisions. But let me just give why I think there's a compelling practical reason to make sure that the chairman of the elder board is a lay elder. I think it's because if you don't, and I've seen this worked out in so many ways, it's very hard for those men on staff not to just go along. But beyond that, it becomes essentially a staff-led church. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm, for example, if I'm the guy who's now the chairman, and I'm the major voice preaching and teaching every week, I wield a lot of influence, and now I'm running the meetings, pretty soon it becomes Tom's church, or it becomes a staff church. Mm-hmm. I think there's great wisdom to having a lay elder run the meeting. And that's the same reason, honestly, that I think there's great wisdom in having more lay elders than staff elders. That's something we've committed to here at Countryside. Because if there are more staff elders than there are lay elders, well, think about that. If I want to, and hopefully I would never want to do this, but if I wanted to exert my influence and authority to get my way, pretty hard for those guys who are depending on the church for their salary, and they know that ultimately comes back to whether I'm happy with them or not. Pretty hard for them to speak against something I want in a meeting. If on the other hand, you have a majority of lay elders, then they're not beholden to me for their salary. You know, they have work, and they are much freer to speak their mind on a given issue than they otherwise would be. I mean, they still have to summon the courage to do that, but it makes it easier for them to do that if there is a plurality of, or I should say a majority of lay elders on the elder board. So for both of those reasons, I think it's important both to have a majority as well as to have the chairman be a lay elder, so that it's clear the pastor isn't running the church, and that the staff isn't running the church. And tell me if this isn't the right time to comment on this, but people may be wondering, I'm talking about staff and lay elders, why? Is there biblical warrant for that? I'll just mention it briefly. Absolutely. There's only one passage in Scripture that addresses it. It's 1 Timothy 5:17. Paul left Timothy in Ephesus, where there was a plurality of elders, and he said to him in 1 Timothy 5:17, some of the elders are to be paid, and some of them aren't to be paid. So clearly the concept is a biblical concept. And so we follow that model, and he lays out the issues there as to why. That's a different discussion probably for a different time, but I think it's important to know that when we talk about staff and lay, that's not some sort of an artificial construct. And that's not even an issue of conscience. That's just following the biblical model that you see in the church in Ephesus. Right.
I do want you to just mention, or maybe I just can mention it and make sure I'm saying what's accurate, but because at Countryside, a lay elder will be the chairman for a year, and then it'll rotate through any of them that want to do that. But you, as a general rule, give them instructions at the beginning of the year, all the things that need to happen over the course of the year, so they know when to schedule it. And then you also meet with them typically the week of an elder meeting and just go over things, because obviously they need that input, right?
Okay. No, that's a good point. I think it's like everything else. I think there needs to be a reminder. Some of the guys, of course, in our setting have been elder chairmen before, but regardless, I still meet with them at the beginning of the year, because it's been a while. If you circulate through your elders, it may have been, in their case, 7-8 years since they were chairman. So just to remind them, so I meet with them, about to meet with the new chairman here shortly for this year, and I'll give him a couple things. One is I'll give him a list of elder chairman responsibilities, what it means to be the chairman. Here's what the rest of the elders are expecting of him, both before the meeting, during the meeting, after the meeting, and just sort of working through that. And in addition to that, I'll give him a a list of those routine items that need to be scheduled throughout the year. So, for example, every church has manse allowances that have to be approved at the end of the year. Well, I have that in the list for a meeting at the end of the year so that when he's putting together the agenda, he can look at that master list and make sure we don't miss that. And of course, you and I both have made sure that happens, but that's just a way for him to know what's coming and to schedule those things. That's at the beginning of the year. And then, as you mentioned, throughout the year, typically we have 2 elders meetings a month. We have it on the first and the third Thursday of each month. We don't always have the second meeting in the month, depending on the number of items in the agenda. Summer's hard to do that. But we always have, or almost always have, the first meeting of the month. So I have traditionally met with the elder chairman at some point before that first meeting of the month. And a lot of that's just personal, for me to have the chance to fellowship with him and just find out what's going on in his family and life and ministry and how to pray for him. That's one of the great joys that I have, is to know and have friendship with the men who serve with me. And that's in some ways just an excuse to do that. But beyond that, it's also a way for us to discuss items that are going to be on the agenda and say, I don't want him to be blindsided by an issue, so maybe there's an issue that's shown up on the agenda. He doesn't know what that is. I'll explain that so he has background on it. And the same way, for if items have been given to him that I haven't seen, there's preparation we need to do at the staff side, bring reports or whatever, we can know that and make sure that we're all on the same page when we get to the meeting. So those meetings have proved invaluable through the years, if for no other reason than just the fellowship and the camaraderie. I hope that they would feel the same, and I think they do. When I come to the end of the year, one of the sad things about changing chairman is that we're not going to have that same regularity in meeting. We still do meet, but through the year, but not at the same level, and I think we both missed that. But it's invaluable.
Talk to me just about the benefit and the need for an agenda, and also just keeping accurate minutes, records.
Well, let me start with the second one. Minutes, for most churches, is a legal issue. And I think whoever's listening to this needs to check their bylaws or their constitution, but in most cases it's required and it's stipulated by the state when you form a corporation or an entity, a 501c3, that you have to keep minutes of the meetings of the leadership. And so that's really just a manner of doing things in a God-honoring way, a way that honors what the government's asked. In addition to that, it's hugely helpful because it allows you to have a record of what was discussed, more importantly, of what was decided. The men who keep our minutes, they'll mark the decisions in a way that makes them stand out, so that if we want to search for decisions that are made, we can do that. In addition, one of our staff keeps track of those decisions in a comprehensive way so that we don't have to wonder. Now, we talked about this 3 years ago, and we made a decision. What was that decision? And we can get back to it pretty quickly. So it's really helpful on both of those fronts, both from just a pure legality standpoint and just practically, because you're not going to remember where you landed on every discussion and decision. But if you have good minutes, you can find that out pretty easily. And I find myself doing that often. The older I get, the more nights I sleep, the less I remember what we decided, in previous meetings. As far as agendas, that is crucial to an effective meeting. I mean, it just is crucial, because if you don't know what you're going to discuss and when, it becomes a free-for-all. And it's the more men you have, the more difficult that becomes. Maybe you can say we can get away with not having an agenda if there are 2 of us. I would encourage you to start there, because I still think it's helpful to say this is what we're going to talk about and in what order. Because if for no other reason, you kind of know how to plan your discussion. Right. We've got 18 items on the agenda. We probably shouldn't spend 50 minutes discussing this one, unless it really warrants it and we're willing to bump the others. And so it's really helpful on that front. But the more men you add to your elder board, the more crucial that becomes, because otherwise you're flying blind in terms of discussion, and anybody can raise anything at any time, and it gets really messy.
Right. How about, Countryside has perpetual elders, that is, they're not rotating on and off the board. And so when a new elder comes onto the board, obviously he has an equal vote as everybody, but how do you instruct him knowing that he just doesn't have the history that many of the other elders have? So how should he function? How do you instruct him to function on the elders?
Well, they're kind of there are nuances for staff elders that wouldn't be true for lay elders. So don't let me forget to come back to that. But I'll start with what would be true for any elder that's a new elder coming on the elder board. I think you want to help them understand, first of all, how an elder board functions. And I mentioned that earlier as far as you don't have some individual authority. Now that you're an elder, you don't go to the music director and say, you need to throw that song out, or no, you don't have that kind of authority. So I think understanding that you fit into the context of the entire elder board that collectively has the authority for what goes on in the church. It starts there, just understanding how you fit. And then I think as a new elder, understanding that yes, you have an equal vote just like everybody else. And that's the way it should be, and that's the way the Lord ordained it. But that's where equality ends. This is what I remind every guy come on the board. It's like, look, the idea that we're all equal may be the Declaration of Independence, but it's not biblical. We're not all equal. We have different ages. We have different levels of maturity. We have different experience. We have different skills. We have different levels of biblical knowledge. And those don't go out the window when we get together as elders. Those are still realities. And so, if Paul is urging Timothy, look, you need to treat the older men in your ministry as fathers. That doesn't change if they're co-elders. There is a treatment of and a respect for people that acknowledges those differences. And so I want an elder coming on to understand that. He has an equal vote to everybody else, but he doesn't have an equal amount to contribute to every discussion. So, for example, if we're talking about corporate real estate and buying, a piece of land, one of our elders has a great background in that. The rest of us ought to be listening, and not to say listening mindlessly, but we ought to be respecting that and acknowledging that. So, just trying to help a new elder understand that's how he fits. We want his wisdom, but we also don't want him to rush into it thinking he's got wisdom to share on every discussion that comes up.
Right.
We want him to be careful. The Proverbs don't go out the window when you become an elder either. And that is, there's sin in many words. So, be careful. Think deliberately about what you're going to say and when you're going to say it as you're getting accustomed to how to fit into an elder board. I think the other key issue that I would share with a new elder is the principle of deferring, and I've alluded to that. But the fact that your job is not to push your view. You're not there to sell everybody else on your view. Your job as an elder is to contribute the wisdom God has given you, insight that you have into this issue, and then to work with the rest of the elders to come to a consensus position where this has become the shared collective view that this is the best way forward.
Right.
So it's understanding that too, because again, a lot of guys, particularly if they're younger guys, can be tempted to come on and think, I have as much to contribute as every other elder here, which is a lie, and I need to hold on to my position and insist on it because otherwise I'm not true to myself. That's just misunderstanding how elders function. It's like, no, you need to contribute what you have, and we need your wisdom if you're an elder and you're elder qualified. But we don't need you to be running roughshod over the rest of the elders to get your vantage point heard and done. Instead, it's no, let's work together to come up with the best way forward.
Yeah, that's right. Come back now to the staff.
Yeah.
You know, when you have staff elders on, and how you handle that with authority and elders and.
Thank you for reminding me. I think obviously what I just said still holds true, and I wanted to share that. I would want to share that with the staff. But in addition, I want them to understand how they fit now as an elder who's also on staff. And reminding them that the elder board as a whole has delegated to me as the senior pastor authority over the staff. And of course, when you were my senior associate, to you and to whoever's in that position. And so I want them to know and understand that when it comes to the day-to-day issues, their work on the staff, their particular ministry, their involvement day-to-day, they are under authority. They're under my authority, not because I have greater intrinsic authority as an elder, but because the elder board as a whole has delegated that position to me. And so when we're dealing with issues at the day-to-day level, they need to submit to me, not because I'm a greater elder, but because I've been given that position by the elder board as a whole, their day-to-day work. So what about when we get to the elder board? And this goes back to something you and I talked about in an earlier episode, but I want them, if they disagree with me, and I know we're going to disagree on an issue when it gets to the elder board, all I ask them is to let me know ahead of time, just so I'm not blindsided. But I want them to be able to speak their mind. I want them to be able to disagree with me respectfully and share their perspective, because again, that's part of the wisdom of the plurality. But I do want them to, just out of graciousness, to let me know that so I'm not blindsided by it. But I'm not going to try to convince them out of that. I want them to share their perspective. I also want them to know that because of that reporting relationship, that if there are issues that are from the staff that need to come to the elder board, they need to come through their immediate supervisor, which either is a senior associate pastor or through me, as opposed to they're just bringing it up.
Right.
Because again, of that nature of when they get to the elder board, they're making decisions about the church as a whole as an elder, and they have an equal vote to me, an equal voice to me, not equal in the sense of contribution, because none of us have equal voices depending on the issue and the time, but an equal voice to be heard and an equal vote. But when it comes to staff-related issues, those need to come through me or through the senior associate pastor. And again, what I ask them on that front is to say, look, if you've got an issue with something that's happening at the staff level because of me and my leadership, all I ask you to do is come to me first and give me a chance to resolve it. And if we can't come to resolution, if you don't feel like it's been truly satisfied, then I'm more than happy for you to bring it to the elders. That's the right way for that to happen. But you would want, and I would want, an opportunity to resolve it first in a way that we both feel is appropriate.
And I think I could say fairly that I don't know of any situation that was ever brought from a staff perspective to the elders out of concern for your leadership. Just for the record,
no,
but I know
I appreciate
I know that that's where you're at. But I think
it has to be there, right? Because
exactly.
what if the senior pastor is going rogue and he's saying to an elder on staff, no, listen, you report to me and you can't take this.
Right.
That undermines the entire point of an elder board and that man is an elder. So it's the balance of those two, right? It's the balance of, okay, there is this principle of plurality. He is an elder, and he's under authority day to day over here. So trying to honor both of those, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think so too. So let's just suppose you're having your elder meeting and you're dealing with a very difficult subject where you know that there's going to be just some varied thoughts and input. I think it's just important, helpful for guys to hear that you don't just take a vote at that point. How do you handle that?
Well, I think at the risk of beating the same drum, I think it comes back to understanding and valuing the principle of plurality. God put those men on the elder board at that church. If we've really done it right, then we believe that Christ himself decided these men should serve on that elder board. And so I think it's acknowledging that and recognizing that each of them have potentially wisdom to contribute. And I think that becomes even more important when it's a controversial issue, an intense discussion about some issue. And you can sense that. I mean, we all have been in meetings and elder boards, where, as you said, in our case, it never gets ugly. It's never, arguments and fights and all of that. But clearly, we don't have a wimp on our elder board, and men feel passionately about what they want to share and what they believe in. We want them to do that. But sometimes when that happens, there are men who are much freer to share their perspective just by virtue of their personalities than others. And there'll be some men who, for whatever reason, sometimes it's just a desire not to create further intensity or whatever. There may be good reasons not to speak up, but I intentionally don't want that to happen. So if it's an intense discussion, if it's a controversial issue, before the vote comes, I intentionally want to hear from every single elder and what they think about that. And so that's what I do. I kind of keep track as the discussion goes on. If it's a heated issue, an intense issue, a controversial issue where there are really sides going on here in discussion, either two sides or maybe more sides, then I'm keeping mental note of who has spoken up and shared their perspective and who hasn't. And before that thing comes to a vote, I want to intentionally pause and say, okay, we need to hear from the rest of you men who haven't spoken yet. This is a major issue. This is a serious question. And obviously, we're not all on the same page. We need to hear from you guys. And so I'll then go around the table and just say, what do you think? Where are you on this issue? Not in putting them on the spot, but in a genuine desire to hear from them and get their perspective. And what that does is, first of all, it reminds us that we're working together to a common end. But it also often shows balance, because sometimes you can't tell where the majority of the elders are based on the most vocal members of the discussion. But by going around the table and getting a feel, pretty soon you got a sense, and it becomes clarifying for us all as to, okay, here's where the real consensus, back to that word, here's where the real consensus of the elder board is, and I need to begin to adjust my own perspective and view toward them. So maybe as I'm sitting there and I'm hearing these men share, I felt passionately on the other side, but as I really think about it, there was only one item on that side I felt passionately about, and maybe there's a way I can suggest, okay, I hear you men, that makes perfect sense to me, there's great wisdom in that. Is there a way we can also address this concern that I have in moving that direction? You see how that works. I mean, that forges that beautiful sense of unity we were talking about in the previous episode, where there is a true unity without uniformity.
Yeah, that's great. So how about Countryside has open elder meetings? What are the benefits of doing that, and what are the things that you have to be careful of as you...
I would say number one is don't have open elder meetings if you have ungodly elders. You don't want to put all the wrong things on display. No, seriously, I think there's great value to open meetings. People want to trust their elders. They want to trust the leadership. And if you're open with everything you can be open with, we have an open portion of our elders' meetings. Obviously, there have to be some items that are done in a closed session. You want to talk about benevolence or church discipline or personnel issues in an open session. So there have to be both. There has to be an open session, and then some items have to go in a closed session. And in our case, we even have a third part of meetings sometimes that we call closed. That's probably an unnecessary way to put it, but it's basically lay elders only, because it involves personnel decisions that have to do with salaries and so forth, and there are conflicts of interest, obviously, with elders on staff talking about those things. But by and large, we have an open portion of the meeting and a closed portion of the meeting. And the closed portion would be, items like discussions about benevolence issues, church discipline, other sorts of issues that really shouldn't be discussed publicly. But we put as much as we can in the open portion, and we invite people to come. And there's benefit to the congregation. Even those who never come, they know they can. And there's a sense of comfort and confidence in that. It's like nothing's being done in a smoke-filled room somewhere. These men are open and willing for us to be there. I think it also models for those who come what it's like to have godly discussions, even intense discussions about issues you disagree about, and come together to a decision. I think there's great benefit in that. I think there's also great benefit in having potential future elders or leaders of the church come, because they get a running start on what it's like to be an elder and to be involved in discussions. Obviously not all of them, but not all the discussions, but many of them, and to see what that looks like. So I think there's great benefit there. We even post that portion of our minutes, the public portion, for our members to see. So those who don't come, again, they know that these are the kinds of things we're talking about and discussions we're having. I think the danger is in having an open meeting is, seriously, if you're not handling things in a respectful, godly, careful way, if you're not planning ahead, if you're flying by the seat of your pants, it becomes obvious. And so that doesn't mean you shouldn't have open meetings. It means you ought to be fine-tuning your elder board so that you can have open meetings and people can come and find them God-honoring, right. Both in how you handle yourself and in the fact that you're actually thinking ahead and you're not just reacting as things come up. And so I think there's really, to kind of be serious about it, there's really only benefit from open meetings. Clearly, at the same time, as I mentioned, there are things that can't go in the open meeting that you're going to have to discuss in a closed session.
Right. And I think it's important for folks to know. I know that there are some churches, when they say open elder meeting, people actually can come and engage in the discussion or bring up issues, and they will address them. But Countryside, when we talk open, the elders are sitting at tables in a very specific area. Then there's chairs set up on the side so people can sit and watch, but the intent is not for them to participate. It's just to have the opportunity to watch the business of the church.
Yeah, no, you make a great point, Rocky. No, it's, again, that's talk about pursuing disunity, is have open meetings in that sense where anybody can come and say anything they want. Just watch a city council meeting. You get a feeling for what that would look like. No, what I mean by open meeting is anybody in the church is invited to attend and observe. So as you said, we have tables usually in a sort of box shape that are set up for the elders. Depending on how many elders you have, you want them facing each other where they can talk and interact. But those who are our guests, those who are members of the church who are invited to the open meeting, even those who may be potential elders, they're not sitting at the tables where the elders are sitting and discussing. They're sitting adjacent, as in kind of an audience perspective, observing the meetings. And they're only asked to participate if they're invited to do so, because there's some reason for them to do so. But they wouldn't do that on a regular basis. We wouldn't simply say, any of you have anything you want to ask or contribute. That would just never happen. So it'd only be if somebody's there and we're talking about a ministry we know they're involved in. We might say, give us an update on that. How's that ministry going, or whatever. Something more like that. But by and large, almost entirely, they would just be an audience watching the elders meet. And again, as I said, there's great value in that and a comfort for the church. Even if they don't come, they know they can.
Yeah. So as we wrap up our discussion on God-honoring elder meetings, how do you keep the business of the church in its proper perspective? That where it's just business. How do you maintain a spiritual perspective as you bring men together? And you have to deal with And obviously, any number of issues that relate to the church.
Yeah, I think first of all, realizing what items should come to the elders for discussion. I mean, in every church, that's going to be a little different depending on the size of the church and all of that. But not every decision that we've delegated to the staff needs to come to the elder board. We want to give a certain latitude for certain decisions. For example, every expenditure that's made doesn't need to come to the elder board. We approve a budget at the beginning of the year, as most churches do. We give them the latitude to spend those monies, and even within a certain framework, some funds that are sort of more generic in every budget that allows them some latitude. So not everything comes. So you need to start there. What is it that needs to come to the elder board? And as I said, that differs to some extent with every church. In our case, taking the financial side of it, it would be any variance to the budget where they're asking to spend more money than's been approved, or some huge variation within their budget where they're going to be spending thousands of more dollars on something than was approved. Those sorts of things. But you don't want the elders dealing only with the business side of the church. So deciding what matters of business need to come to the elders, and then properly delegating the things that can be done elsewhere. I think it starts there. But once you've decided, okay, it needs to come to the elder board, it needs to be a part of the elder discussion, I think two things. One is you don't want to merely have an agenda that's characterized by business discussions, finances, for example. And that's the beauty of having me meet with the chairman of the elders. And once you establish that pattern, every new elder chairman coming along understands that, and every elder understands they can add these kinds of items where there are truly spiritual issues, doctrinal issues, ministry discussion and decisions, new missionaries, all those sorts of things are entering into that agenda and not just the nuts and bolts of the ministry. So I think A, deciding what can be decided at a staff level and what needs to come to the elders. And then B, if it's business type stuff, making sure that's not all that shows up on the elders' agenda, but making sure there's a mix of those discussions as there ought to be. And then once you get to those business discussion items, trying as much as you can to tie them back to ministry, not making them purely business, but reminding yourselves that this is part of your shepherding ministry. It's part of your role. And even, for example, these are little things, but what I'll often do is if we get a really positive report, on our finances, it's like, let's tie that back to the Lord. The only reason this is true is because of what the Lord has done in our church. So let's take a moment and let's give Him thanks together for what He's done. If we're in the middle of discussing a matter of business that's maybe about the logistics of an upcoming conference, let's take a moment and pray for that. So I think limiting the number of items that are pure business that really don't need to be at the elder level, and then those that show up there, as much as possible, connecting them to the spiritual side and ministry of the church so that we're not losing sight of that's really what we're doing here. This is the Lord's business. We might be deciding a budget, but this is funding ministry. This is enabling gifted people to do what God has called them to do. So just always trying to bring that back. And I'm not the only one that does that. All of our elders are very good at that. But I think you have to develop that attitude and spirit among your elders so that you're all doing that together and collectively.
Thanks for sharing. I will say that for me, being an elder with you here for so many years, it was the first time I served in a church that I actually enjoyed going to the elder meetings. And that's awful, right? That it would be like that. But there was a time it was like, man, the last thing I want to do is go to an elder meeting. But to be a part of a group of men who were there for the right reasons, had the same commitment and desired God's honor above all else, boy, it just makes it such a fruitful time and an encouraged time, blessed time. And I think that's that unity that then flows to the church. And
no, you're right.
I've often thought, that a church cannot spiritually mature beyond the maturity of its leaders. And that's where that's so important and valuable. So I appreciate you sharing with us, Tom. I love
Rocky.
you. I appreciate your ministry. And
My
thanks
only
for
regret
doing
as an
this.
elder is that you're not still one here at Countryside.
But I come back often enough that sometimes I think you might wonder if I'm not still here.
No, it's good to visit with you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about these things. I know that we both are passionate about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again for watching. XL Ministries exists to come alongside the local church to encourage and equip in leadership development. Whether that's lay leaders in the church, elders, or even training pastors in the context of the local church, we want to come alongside and help in that process. You can visit our website, xlministries.org, to learn more about how we do that through pastoral internships, as well as a variety of other resources and ministry training.